Tim. Hero. Come on, Tim. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thank you to Senators Menendez, Kaine, and Duckworth for joining me on topics of importance to us today, and particularly AUMF. But first, I want to say something on trains. I want to first talk about a letter I sent today to the NTSB, the chair, regarding the dangerous and wanton acts, folks. I sent a letter to the chair of the NTSB regarding the dangerous and wanton acts of corporate greed in the rail industry. Though I'm glad to hear the NTSB is investigating the devastating derailment in Ohio, they can't stop there. For years, freight rail companies have lobbied to loosen regulations, neglect safety upgrades, lay off workers. In fact, over the past 5 years, there have been 26,500 accidents and incidents. Worse, 2,768 fatalities, and over 30,000 employees cut. 20% of the workforce has been cut. That's not just negligent. It's dangerous. It's life-threatening, as we saw in Ohio. So I've asked the NTSB to investigate all 7 of the Class 1 freight railroad companies and issue findings, recommendations, and regulations to improve safety, to investigate BNSF, CSX, Union Pacific, Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, and Kansas City Southern. And I've asked the chair to answer a number of questions. What specific regulations and standards are needed to provide the utmost safety to the rail industry? How have deregulatory pushes contributed to these derailments and increased deaths? And right now, local communities are only notified of hazardous trains coming through if they have a certain number of cars or a specific type of hazardous substance. Is that too narrow? Can we expand this to give more transparency? I need answers. We all need answers. America needs answers to these questions so we can make meaningful change in the rail industry. One other point on H.R. 1 before I get to AUMF, where my colleagues will speak on at length. Today, House Republicans rolled out a partisan, dead-on-arrival proposal to address America's energy needs that they had the nerve to name H.R. 1. H.R. 1 will lock America into the most expensive and volatile, dirty sources of energy, will set America back a decade or more in our transition towards clean, affordable energy. The package is a wish list for big oil, gutting important environmental safeguards on fossil fuel projects, while doing none of the important permitting reforms that would bring transmission and clean energy projects online faster. Transmission is vital to getting green energy from where it's produced to where the people are, and they don't have the kind of transmission reform, any modicum of it, that is needed. Any serious permitting package must also focus on the needs of the future as America transitions to clean energy. We need to take steps in Congress to ease that transition, ensure that clean energy is reliable, accessible, and most of all, affordable. That includes efforts to expedite onshoring and construction of industries critical to our national security, like we did in chips and science. Permitting reform is an essential step in laying the foundation of the energy future. Thankfully, there are Democrats and Republicans talking in both houses to permit a deal forward. We need a bipartisan, bicameral effort on permitting reform, and I would do everything I can to get that to happen. Finally, on the AUMF. Yesterday, we took the first step to officially repeal the AUMF of 1991 and 2002, and tomorrow we will vote on cloture. Americans are tired of endless wars, and thanks to the folks here with me, this is the week the Senate will begin the process to end the legal authority that started the Iraq War 2 decades ago. March 19th will mark the 20th anniversary of that invasion. The Iraq War has been over for more than 10 years. The reality on the ground has long since changed, so laws on the books must change too. This was a bipartisan effort, and I just want to thank the people here. Senator Kaine has been relentless. This has been a passion of his. We tried to get this done last year in the NDAA, but people wouldn't let it happen. But he has been relentless. Senator Menendez has worked the committee very well, so it passed out by a 13-8 bipartisan vote. And that's why we're very optimistic it will get the 60 votes it needs. And Senator Duckworth has so strongly represented veterans and heroes who have risked so much for us. So it's a great team to elaborate on AUMF. Senator Menendez.
Well, thank you, Mr. Leader. Look, as senators, our gravest responsibility in our position is deciding when to authorize the use of military force. It's a decision about life and death. It's a decision about sending our sons and daughters into harm's way. Congress authorized the use of such a force in 1991 and 2002 against Iraq, decades ago. Now, I personally am proud to have voted against going to war with Iraq in 2002. I think history has proven that was the right call, but that's not the question that will be before the Senate tomorrow and next week. So in a world where these authorizations no longer make any sense or serve any purpose that Congress could have intended, we're moving forward with their repeal. I want to join Senator Schumer in commending Senator Kaine, member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who has been driving this issue along with Senator Young for the better part of several years now, and has now brought it to maturation that we're hopefully going to have some good success next week. And Senator Duckworth, who has now joined our committee as well, and we're thrilled to have her history, her expertise, and her insights on issues like this and others. The Iraq of 2023 is far different than the Iraq of 1991 or 2003. Saddam Hussein has been dead for 2 decades. The U.S. is no longer an occupying force in Iraq. We are partners with the Iraqi government and people in an important strategic relationship, cooperating on everything from health and energy and climate to protecting American personnel and assets in the region to counter the threat from Iran. Repealing these outdated authorizations reflects that reality, and it will ensure that they are not abused by future administrations. Now, some will ask whether repeal of the authorization impacts our ability to protect the nation against Iran. Take it from me, as someone who has worked for a couple of decades to confront the challenge of Iran, this will have no impact on defending against any Iranian threat. The President already has authority under the 2001 AUMF and the Constitution for military operations against ISIS or Iranian-backed groups that threaten U.S. personnel. The AUMFs that we are repealing add nothing to those efforts. So we stand on the brink of history. As Senator Kaine has said, it's been decades since we ever repealed an AUMF. We're asserting congressional responsibility not only to declare war, but to finally end those that no longer need this authority. With that, let me turn to Senator Kaine.
Well, thanks to my colleagues, and I want to thank Senator Schumer, who, when we first got this bill out of committee in the last Congress, promised me a floor vote, and then circumstances conspired against us, but his promise didn't have an expiration date on it. And he said when we started into the 118th Congress, keep working and we'll do this. The Iraq War resolution was passed in October of 2002. I was the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, had no interest in being ever in the United States Senate, certainly didn't know that I one day would be. At that time, I had no idea that my 12-year-old son, oldest son, would become a Marine infantry officer. But I listened to that debate about the Iraq War, and it infuriated me. It infuriated me that it was being forced on Congress right before a midterm election. The invasion didn't start till March. There was nothing about that debate that was sort of according to Hoyle. There was no reason it should be put into a midterm election context, but that's what happened, and it so angered me that when I eventually got elected to the United States Senate in 2012, I fought to get on the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee so that I could work with colleagues to try to get Congress to take more seriously the grave responsibility in Article 1 that we shouldn't go to war without a vote of Congress. Iraq is no longer an enemy. You followed, Secretary Austin was there last week a very productive meeting with Prime Minister al-Sudani to talk about the work we're doing with Iraq to continue to battle against ISIS and other non-state terrorist organizations, to check Iranian aggression, to promote regional stability. There's no reason to have a war authorization against a nation that is now a security partner. So after 20 years, it's time to repeal this and show again that Congress can exercise that Article 1 muscle. There's more to do in this space, but if we begin with this repeal, and then hopefully with a good bipartisan vote, send a message that can gain some momentum in the House as well, where we have very broad bipartisan sponsorship, Congress can start to take back this power that is the most sacred one we have and that we should jealously guard. Let me now introduce my foreign relations colleague, who is a warfighter and a hero and a superb senator, the Senator from Illinois, Tammy Duckworth.
Behind you here. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. You know, in 2012, I first started talking to Senator Kaine about this because as he was being sworn into the Senate, I was being sworn into the House and onto the House Armed Services Committee. And I wanted to talk about ending the AUMF because I think it is the best way that we can support our troops. Look, most people run away from battle, but our service members run toward it. They watch their brothers and sisters get wounded. They miss births and funerals, school plays and college graduations. Then they come home bearing the wounds of war, both visible and otherwise. They will always do their job, our servicemen and women, defending our country, no matter the sacrifice. So they deserve to know that they have the moral support and most current legal backing of this nation. But for more than 20 years, Washington has failed to give them that. One of Congress's most solemn duties is deciding when and how we send Americans into combat by debating and passing authorizations for the use of military force. These documents set the legal framework for military action that are supposed to define the mission for the Americans who are going downrange. But lately, too many in these halls of power in Washington have shrugged off that duty, hiding behind this outrageously outdated document. They've been scared of the political risks that come with bringing these wars back into the spotlight. They've been staring down election days. Congress has shirked its responsibility to our troops. For more than 20 years since passing these AUMFs, those in power have stretched and skewed their original intent. We've left our troops without a clearly defined mission, without clearly defined parameters, without an off-ramp. So now they face an increasing risk that a future commander-in-chief may improperly interpret the law to send them into future armed conflicts that this AUMF was never intended to authorize. Our troops deserve better than that. If we choose to send the finest among us into battle, then we need to debate and vote to do so based on current conditions. Enough of being more worried about political consequences than about our troops in harm's way. And until we muster up the courage in these halls of power to ask and answer the tough questions that will actually tell our troops what they're fighting for, we will not be living up to their sacrifices. Instead, we will be leaving them in an endless loop, refusing even to look for that off-ramp. Look, it really shouldn't be that hard. Anyone who claims the mantle of patriotism can't keep demanding such sacrifices from our service members while refusing to step up to our obligation, our responsibility, to have a public debate and vote when we ask our troops to go into combat. It's time, it's long past time, that we repeal this decades-old AUMF and start honoring the troops in the way that they deserve, maybe with a little courage ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Okay, question.
Senator,
Yes.
do you support the Senator Warren bill to push back the deregulation of Dodd-Frank?
Okay, we need strong legislation, and hopefully we can put something together that's bipartisan.
Leader,
Yes.
Does anything about this crisis with SVB and other banks, does that concern you in the way that things were in 2008? And does that spook members in trying to figure out what is the right course of action in these circumstances?
Well, look, I have faith in President Biden, Secretary Yellen, and the Federal Reserve. They have all hands on deck to manage this and keep our economy sound.
What about
yes.
Congress?
I heard you talking about HR1, clean energy. Do you agree with President Biden's decision to greenlight the Willow Oil project, the drilling project in Alaska?
Look, the bottom line is that this HR1, as I said, is a bill just for the oil companies. It doesn't deal what we need for clean energy, and we need to get something done better. Without transmission, all of it isn't going to matter. Yes?
Schumer, are you worried that regional banks are losing deposits to big banks, and should there be unlimited guarantees of bank deposits in order to prevent these deposits from fleeing the smaller?
Well, as I said, we need strong legislation, and hopefully we can get something bipartisan done. That's what our goal is.
Senator,
Yes.
on the Silicon Valley Bank failure, did the San Francisco Fed make a mistake or miss an obvious problem here? You're a former member of the Senate Banking Committee. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, look, we need a thorough investigation as to what went wrong and hold those responsible accountable. Last one over there. Yeah.
Republican leaders are asking for amendment votes as part of the AUMF repeal bill. Do you expect that you'll have to give those to them to get on the bill?
We expect to have amendment votes, and we're going to work together. Senator Menendez will work with Senator Risch and Senator Kaine and Senator Young so that we can have some amendment votes. Yes. Thank you, everybody.
No comment on Aaron Rodgers to the Jets? Is he going to the Jets? Yeah.
I think he's a Giant.
You know what my question was going to be? Is there any effort to reform? Very niche question. Actually, I heard it was I should work for roll call. Let's do it. All right, Frank, I gotta go. You leaving?
Pat, there's one picture used Scotty, where I have my hand is like this, and it looks like I'm the Emperor in Star Wars giving him the Force, you know?
Yeah, when you get close.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I didn't think he was the same thing. Is that a new dance step there?
Yes, it is.
Everybody? Well, good afternoon. Let me just start by saying that all of us in the Republican Conference are wishing Leader McConnell the very best and in his recovery, and look forward to having him back. But in the meantime, we're going to be talking about the contrast, the differences between Republicans and Democrats, and there's probably no better example of that than the president's budget, which came out on Monday. And, you know, most president's budgets, when they come out, they always refer to them as being dead on arrival. This particular proposal is dead wrong when it comes to its priorities. And I'll just start with the spending and debt. It's going to grow the federal debt, if you can believe this, in the next 10 years up to $50 trillion. In terms of just the spending itself, we heard today at lunch, 55% increase in spending since 2019, and at a time when the population of the country was only growing at 1.8%. Almost $5 trillion in tax increases on job creators and small businesses in this country. And if you look at just the overall picture of where they prioritize, where they spend their money, that's where it really gets disturbing, because they actually increase the IRS's budget by 15%, and a $30 billion increase over and above the $80 billion increase that they got last August and the 87,000 new employees they got last August. Now think about that. They only add 350 people to the Border Patrol to police the southern border, which is, we all acknowledge, is a national emergency, national security crisis. And then they fund defense at below the rate of inflation. 3% increase for inflation, or for defense, 15% increase for the IRS. If that doesn't talk about what your priorities are, I don't know what is. So this budget is dead on arrival, and the massive amount of spending and taxing and borrowing that is included in it is something that not only Republicans here in the Senate are going to do everything we can to stop, but I believe the American people are going to be on our side.
Thank you. I'm glad that we are talking about budgets today, because we all know that what President Biden put forward, it is so out of touch and is very unaffordable. And Iowans comment about this as they've watched the news. They see that President Biden intends to raise taxes. He is killing jobs with his budget proposal, and he's hurting our small businesses. Again, Iowans see that it's reckless. Americans know this. I'm glad they're paying attention. And because they're paying attention, and it is Sunshine Week, what we would like to see is more transparency out there. And we need President Biden to fully explain the budget that he's put forward. But beyond that, I'm forcing our federal agencies to put a public price tag on all of the taxpayer-funded projects. All of us are paying for these projects, and you've heard about some of them out there. You know, the old adage of shrimp on a treadmill, or pampering your kitties. Whatever experimentation the federal government is doing, whatever projects they are working on, the public needs to know about it, and they need to know how much of their hard-earned dollars are going to those projects. So again, we need to shine light on these projects that are out there. It is Sunshine Week. We need more transparency within our federal government. Let's start today, folks, and let's get a little accountability out there.
Well, thank you all for being here. I would like to add to what Senator Thune said about all of our thoughts and how much we miss our leader, Senator McConnell. I would like to say we miss having Senator Barrasso with us here today. He, as many of you know, has health issues within his family, so please offer him up in your thoughts and prayers during this time, and his family. And as Joni said, a budget is a set of priorities. Whether it's dead on arrival or in some form or fashion, it is a reflection of what the president really and where he puts his emphasis. John mentioned the IRS. I'm going to mention the 19% increase in the EPA and the 1% cut in Homeland Security. There's a cut in small business. There's a cut in transportation. These are what the president's priorities are. He's prioritizing through not just the dollar figures, but the rhetoric contained within the summary. So if you look at the summary of the budget, which is what we were looking at last week, one of the priorities that I have, and we all have, and we should all have as a nation, is to stop the flow of fentanyl and all the deaths that are causing. In my state of West Virginia, 1,100 people died from fentanyl overdoses. They mentioned fentanyl twice in the budget. They mentioned climate change 42 times. And that, I think, is a reflection of where this administration wants to spend our taxpayers' dollars and overspend our taxpayers' dollars and not solve the problems. They actually have in their Department of Homeland Security budget their own built-in supplemental surge pricing. So if I'm pulling these figures out, they're not exactly accurate. You have a certain amount of people that come over the border because there's no deterrence, so we know this is going to happen. That means you're going to get another several hundred millions of dollars to deal with the problem that you're creating because of the lack of the policies within your administration. So I think that the more and more that we see what's going on in this budget, and the more we see the reflection of the president's priority and his party's priorities, much more spending that's going to be reflected down to individual citizens. I think we're going to see, as the administration people come before us, which, as Joni said, transparency is the best way and questioning is the best way, we're going to see that the priorities that this budget sets put us on a track of overspending, more debt, more deficit, and a weaker position as a country.
So we've been watching President Biden and the Senate Democrats' very reckless financial policies, and we're seeing crisis after crisis after crisis, and now the chickens are coming home to roost. Wasteful spending has led to the highest inflation rates we've seen in the United States in 40 years. And now these bank bailouts
are going to put Montana banks and Montana families on the hook for the mismanagement of a Bay Area bank. Why is it that well-managed and sound Montana banks that didn't fail are going to be on the hook to pay for a mismanaged Bay Area bank that did? The same thing was true with President Biden's bogus student debt transfer, forcing Montanans who maybe didn't go to college to now pay for somebody else's loans. The last thing the federal government should be doing is taking the side of wealthy elites over hardworking Montanans. We need to return some fiscal sanity back to Washington. Montanans can't afford this administration's and the Senate Democrats' fiscal restlessness.
Senator Thune, good afternoon. Do you have a sense from your fellow senators that they are struggling to figure out what to do about SVB because there's echoes of 2008, concerns the way the TARP went down, that a legislative solution is very hard to come to an agreement on because of those echoes?
Well, I think that most of our members, first and foremost, want to have the question answered by the regulators, what happened? I mean, how come they were asleep at the switch and didn't see this coming? I mean, these are pretty obvious indicators, and there's still a lot of unrealized losses on the balance sheets of banks around the country. This clearly, if you look at the particular circumstances around this incident, should have been anticipated. And so those are the questions we're going to want to get the answers to.
What message does it send to Vladimir Putin when one of the leading contenders, potential contenders for the Republican presidential nomination, says that this is not a vital interest for the United States, this war in Ukraine, and that it's merely a territorial dispute?
Well, I mean, I think that there are lots of different opinions on U.S. involvement in Ukraine, but I think the majority opinion among Senate Republicans is that the United States has a vital national security interest there in stopping Russian aggression, and that's certainly the view I have.
Senator Thune, have you specifically and directly spoken with Leader McConnell?
I have not spoken with him. I have communicated with him, but we look forward to making that happen.
How do you communicate with him?
Well, text.
Yeah. What do you tell me? Are you concerned about regional banks losing deposits to big banks in this crisis? And should there be unlimited guarantees of bank deposits to prevent these deposits from leaving smaller banks to bigger banks?
Well, I think you heard Steve Daines speak to this, but there would be a lot of concern among people in most parts of the country, and certainly in rural parts of the country, that have banks that operate well, that are well managed, well capitalized, although capital wasn't really the issue with SVB, it was a liquidity issue. But I think there are people across the country who are watching this closely and are going to try to determine whether or not they're going to be on the hook for a lot of this mismanagement. But again, I would come back to the thing we want to get answered first and foremost is, where did the regulators fail? Why did we not anticipate this and see this coming, knowing full well that there were lots of warning signs that should have tipped the regulators off?
Senator, any appetite on your side of the aisle, depending on how this investigation turns out, if they do say that regulators didn't have enough tools to prevent something like Silicon Valley Bank failure from happening, would there be any appetite on your side of the aisle to consider tougher regulations by legislation?
I think we would obviously we want to get all the facts in, and I think that's where oversight comes into play. And we have a number of committees of jurisdiction, namely the Banking Committee, who I hope are going to get to the bottom of the questions that we have about why the exam process, the supervision process failed, before we get to that next question. I mean, if there are ideas out there that people have, at some point we'd be willing to entertain those, but I think it'd be premature to start talking about solutions before we fully define the problem and ultimately get answers from the regulators about why they were asleep at the job.
Thank you.
U.S. response